When they entered the farmhouse that night, they were not looking for money, and they were not looking for revenge. The three men who had come to Nelson Rehmeyer's door believed something had already begun long before they arrived there, and that what waited inside the house was not simply an old man living alone in rural Pennsylvania. They believed he had done something to them. By the time morning came, Rehmeyer would be dead inside his own home, and one of the strangest murder trials in American history would begin forming around an explanation the court could not ignore, even if it did not belong comfortably inside a courtroom. In the late autumn of 1928, John Blymeyer had reached a point where ordinary setbacks no longer felt ordinary. Illness had returned more than once. Work had become unstable. Personal difficulties that might once have been accepted as ordinary bad fortune began to gather weight because they continued without relief and without a clear cause, he trusted. In the farming communities south of York, where older explanations still lived beside modern ones, repeated hardship did not always remain nameless. York County still carried traditions that had arrived generations earlier with Pennsylvania German settlers, practical beliefs that lived quietly besides church attendance, farm labor, and ordinary domestic life. Certain books were kept for protection, and certain spoken remedies were still trusted. A prayer, a phrase, or a written charm could still be treated as useful when ordinary explanations felt incomplete. In that world, a difficult season did not always remain only a difficult season. Sometimes it became evidence that someone, somewhere, had acted against you in a way that could not be seen directly. Blymeyer did not arrive immediately at one name. He first moved through a chain of consultations, speaking to people believed locally to understand misfortune in ways ordinary medicine or ordinary advice did not always satisfy. Accounts differ in detail about which conversation came first, but they agree that Blymeyer sought repeated confirmation rather than one immediate answer. The more often he asked, the less random his own troubles began to feel. Different names and possibilities appear briefly in later retellings, but eventually the consultations narrowed rather than expanded. Suspicion stopped moving. It settled on one person, Nelson Rehmeyer. Rehmeyer was 60 years old and lived alone on a farm in a hollowed stretch of rural land outside York. He was known locally, though not in any dramatic sense. He farmed, kept to himself, and had a reputation connected to all the folk practices, sometimes described as powwow or brokerij, forms of healing that combined spoken prayer, ritual phrases, and inherited remedies passed through generations. These practices were not presented locally as something theatrical or forbidden. To many who knew him, they belonged to the same world as home remedies, scripture, and practical rural knowledge. He was also known to possess books associated with those traditions, including The Long Lost Friend, a 19th century collection of charms, prayers, and protective formulas, copied, purchased, and preserved in many Pennsylvania German homes. But in Bleimeyer's mind, the distinction between healing and harm had already begun to narrow. Once Rehmeyer's name had been spoken, ordinary details about him started to gather new meaning. The fact that he lived apart, the fact that all the practices followed his name, the fact that people still sought him out for medical remedies. None of this proved anything, but proof was no longer what Bleimeyer believed he needed. He believed he had found the person responsible. Belief became more dangerous once it was attached to instructions. Bleimeyer was told that if Nelson Rehmeyer had indeed placed a harmful influence over his life, that the influence could be broken, but only if certain things were taken directly from him. A lock of hair was required. The book would also need to be found. Hair could be buried. The book could be burned. If both were removed, Bleimeyer believed what had been affecting him might finally end. The instructions were simple enough to feel possible because they did not require mystery once the belief had already been accepted. They required entering a house, taking objects, and leaving with them. By then the idea no longer felt strange to him. It felt necessary. He did not go alone. Wilbert Hess and John Curry agreed to come with him, and together the three men made their way towards Rehmeyer's farmhouse. The property stood in a quiet hollow, reached by narrow rural roads, isolated enough that arrival after dark would not immediately draw notice. It was late November. The fields were stripped by season, and night settled early over the surrounding ground. Their purpose, at least as they would later explain it, was not to kill him. They intended to confront him, obtain what they needed, and leave. Rehmeyer allowed them inside. The house itself offered nothing dramatic. A working farmhouse, lit and occupied, containing the ordinary signs of a man living alone. Whatever the three men believed waited there had to exist, if it existed at all, inside ordinary furniture. ordinary walls, ordinary rooms. They began searching for the book almost immediately. Drawers were opened, shelves were checked. The search moved through the room with growing impatience. When the object they expected was not immediately placed before them, that delay mattered because every additional moment inside the house forced belief to remain in direct contact with the ordinary presence of the man they had come to confront. Accounts differ slightly in wording, but not in direction. The conversation became harder, voices rose, and Rehmeyer did not surrender control of the room simply because three younger men had entered it together. He resisted. During that struggle, the attempt to obtain hair also became physical. What at first existed as instruction now required direct force against the person from whom it had been taken. Blows were struck. Rehmeyer was overpowered, restrained with rope, and forced into a position where three younger men controlled the movement of a single older one inside his own home. The object they had come for no longer stood separate from the man himself. By then, whatever distance had existed between belief and violence had already closed. Once Nelson Rehmeyer had been restrained, the original purpose of the visit had already become impossible to separate from what the room now contained. Whether from panic, confusion, or the belief that what had already happened still needed to be completed in a way that could not be undone. Coal oil was brought into the sequence. It was poured over Rehmeyer's body. A fire was then set inside the farmhouse. But the fire did not do what they expected. It spread only partially, blackening sections of the room without consuming the structure itself. Smoke marked the interior. Walls carried the damage. Yet by morning the farmhouse still stood, holding almost everything they had tried to leave behind. Inside it, the men left before the fire had erased what they believed it might erase. When daylight came, the farmhouse remained where it had been the night before, quiet, visible, and still occupied by what had happened there. Rehmeyer's body was found inside. Outside, the day was already turning into Thanksgiving. In surrounding homes, ordinary routines had begun. Meals would be prepared. Fires would be lit for different reasons. But inside the farmhouse in the hollow, the previous night had remained suspended long enough to be entered and read clearly. The investigation moved quickly because the event itself had left little room for disappearance or uncertainty. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and John Curry were identified quickly, and once arrested, the explanation they offered did not attempt to hide behind ordinary criminal motives. They spoke openly about what they believed had brought them there. Misfortune, illness, and decline had not felt random to Blymeyer. He had accepted that another person stood behind them. Once Rehmeyer had been named, the visit to the farmhouse had become, in his mind, an attempt to remove what had been placed over his life. In court, details that usually remained inside private belief were spoken aloud in formal sequence. Hair, charms, protective books, and the conviction that one human being could quietly direct harm into another person's life without touching them directly. For the court, the murder itself was clear. The explanation behind it was what made the case difficult to place beside ordinary criminal motive. The long-lost friend entered public attention as part of the explanation, though the book itself had long existed in many homes, not as something sinister, but as a source of folk remedies, prayers, and protection. That distinction no longer changed what had already happened inside the farmhouse. Blymeyer and Curry received life sentences. Hess, younger and treated differently by the court, received a lesser sentence. The Hollow, where Rehmeyer lived, gradually became known by another name, Hex Hollow, but the name remains attached to the case, did not alter its simplest fact. Nelson Rehmeyer died because several ordinary men accepted that invisible harm required human answer. Nothing in the room where he died proved that such harm had ever existed, but belief had already become strong enough to leave marks fire could not fully erase. The record remembers.